Hello, everyone. We're going to try something new today, and I'm going to be going over my vinyl collection. So there's quite a bit of vinyl, so this might be split up in a couple videos, but I wanted to go over them. And a couple things before we get started. One, they're in no particular order, although I did organize them by band. So if there's bands with multiple albums that I own, I will be covering those back to back. And let's get started. We're gonna get started with some new ones that I got recently. Nine Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine. One of my favorites by them. They kind of lost me a little bit later with some of the more alternative rock type albums, but this one's very cool, almost like a gothic dance synthy album. Some of my favorites on this are Sin, Terrible Lie, and Something I Can Never Have. A really cool album with a cool story. Trent Reznor was working as a janitor at the record company and was doing this on the side. You can kind of tell this is a DIY album when you listen to it, that he's doing everything by himself, figuring it out on his own. I believe he only really knew how to play piano, and he learned all the other instruments as he went along, including guitar. Just a really cool, angsty album that got Trent Reznor on the map and started his illustrious career. So that's Pretty Hate Machine. Next thing is another new album, Crypt Sermon, The Dawn of Fading Light. Oh no, The Ruin of Fading Light. My bad, I just got this one. Very cool. I learned about these guys because they were originally, well, some of the members were a part of Trench Rot, which was a death metal band from Philadelphia that actually, when I was in high school, was one of the first bands that got me into death metal, and we'll get into more death metal stuff later. But Crypt Sermon is epic doom metal, a la Solitude Eternus and Candlemass. Very cool, kind of atmospheric, epic metal. I wouldn't say it's all doom, but there are heavy doom kind of slow riffs. I would say it's more of a mix of traditional heavy metal and epic doom. My favorite track is The Key of Solomon, but also Christ is Dead and The Snake Handler are also very cool. So that's Crypt Sermon. And speaking of Trench Rot, the band that I got into because of learning about Trench Rot was Bolt Thrower. Now, these guys are really important for me as far as getting into death metal. This is Realms of Chaos, but this is the reprint where they don't say Slaves to Darkness on it. Very cool. They were originally kind of like a grindcore band, kind of like what Carcass and Napalm Death were doing early in their career. But Bolt Thrower were different. They definitely had a lot chunkier guitars, and that really comes through on their second album here, Realm of Chaos. You still get some of the grind influence, like on with blast beats all over this place, kind of a punk rock attitude. But you got these low tuned, like down to A standard, which is ridiculously low for a guitar. I think they were using baritone guitars. My favorite songs on this have to be Through the Eye of Terror, World Eater, but I mean, most of this is just all killer death metal. This is the reprint, of course, so it doesn't have the original Games Workshop art on it, but it's still very cool. And I said earlier, anything that I had two of, I would get into back to back. So again, Bolt Thrower, The Fourth Crusade. Now this is where they took the death metal stuff and really stripped it back. This could almost be called Death Doom, although I wouldn't call it that. It's definitely still death metal, but the riffs are much slower. They bring it back a lot. Some of the riffs are repeated a lot more, but that would also be a lot of Bolt Thrower's style going through the rest of the 90s after this. So the Fourth Crusade, I would say if anyone's trying to get into death metal at all, this is a really good place to start because the riffs are catchy. The production is very good. Some people say the production is like flat, but I don't think so. I think it's really killer. The guitar tone is super chunky. It's got that great kind of 90s scooped sound, but with the bass still there too underneath, so everything sounds really full. I gotta say, the opening track, the Fourth Crusade, is one of the highlights. Same with Where Next to Conquer and Ritual. Ritual has this breakdown at the end of it that is just so. I mean, you just get an instant stank face listening to it. So that is Bolt Thrower, the Fourth Crusade. Here's another recent pickup, which I am very excited about. Artillery by Inheritance. Yes, I would have never thought that I would be able to actually hold on to this album. It kind of went out of production in the 90s for a long, long time. And I only learned about this through like YouTube comments when I was getting really into thrash metal, like 5 or 6. Well, I've been into thrash metal for a long time, but I was digging deeper about 5 or 6 years ago and found um, this album. Now, this album gets a lot of attention online as just being really good technical thrash metal, but it's just so well written. The guitar riffs, I mean, if you ever look at the guitar riffs on this album, they're just so intricate and the picking's so precise. The production actually helps. There's a cool fan made like remaster on YouTube that I would check out too, which is kind of cool. But the original production's fine. Some of the highlights from this are, I mean, the entire first side of the album, where it goes from Comaniac to Beneath the City R.I.P. to the title track By Inheritance to Bomb Food. I mean, those are all 10 out of 10 thrash metal tracks. If you like things like Rust in Peace or I guess like Heathen, this is a little bit of Voivod or any of the like Watchtower, any of those like progressive metal, late 80s, early 90s progressive metal bands. They were definitely paying attention because Artillery, I listened to their old stuff. It's definitely more straight ahead thrash metal. This is where they went into a whole different stratosphere. It's kind of unfortunate what happened with them. You know, the band kind of never really found their footing, unfortunately, in the 90s. And then just recently, Morton, um, I don't have his name right here. Oh, um, there it is. Morton Strutzer. He died recently. I think he was the main composer on this. And I actually have a sneaking suspicion that's part of the reason why we were able to get this remaster in the first place by. Oh man, I forget which. You know what? I'll take a look at it later. But there is a different company that printed these. If you can get your hands on these are brand new, great. I would definitely check it out. Oh, another classic. Painkiller, of course. Judas Priest, Painkiller. I gotta say, this is probably the album that got me into Judas Priest because I was so into Metallica and Megadeth growing up, and this is stylistically pretty similar. I wouldn't say it's very representative of a lot of Judas Priest's career, which I've kind of gotten more into recently and been able to appreciate the stuff from the 70s and the early 80s just for what they did to metal. Rob Halford's book is really excellent. Confess, I would recommend reading it. But with Painkiller, it's just an entire album full of bangers, and the production's very good. They were definitely paying attention to how metal sounded in the late 80s, early 90s, with bands like Pantera becoming very popular. Well, they will become popular. I think they actually opened for Judas Priest on the Painkiller tour. But the tone for the guitars are just excellent, and these are the best solos, or some of the best like riffs and solos that KK and Glenn Tipton ever wrote. Um, Everyone knows Painkiller, but One Shot at Glory, Between the Hammer and the Anvil, and Hell Patrol are all kind of underrated. I would say even you can't really say anything on this album is underrated. Anyway, Painkiller, and for probably the last part, well, we could probably do two more albums. Judas Priest again, Defenders of the Faith. Recently picked this up. Very cool. Kind of picked up where Screaming for Vengeance left off. I would say this is a little heavier than Screaming for Vengeance. Screaming for Vengeance has a lot of those kind of ballady, slow parts. I don't really think there's that much of that happening on this album. I guess like Love Bites, but I mean, all these songs have killer riffs. Jawbreaker, The Sentinel, Some Heads Are Gonna Roll. These are all just heavy riffs. This is like heavy Judas Priest, and I know they would kind of stray a little bit with Turbo and kind of bring it back a little bit with Ram It Down, but then of course Painkiller, they kind of tie up the whole 80s going into the 90s there really well. So, Defenders of the Faith. We're going to do one more for this part 1 video. Atheist. Piece of Time. Piece of Time, Atheist. This is a Florida death metal band, definitely taking more progressive lens on it. These guys obviously were very influenced by Voivod, I would say, and other technical thrash of the time, but this is just where technical death metal kind of has its roots in a way. Not that tech death would really keep sounding like this, because this is still very 80s in a way, which I actually like. I'm a big fan of Necrophagist and some of the other tech bands that have come up in the late 90s and the 2000s, but I really like that Atheist has a technical death metal album here that still sounds like it's rooted in thrash. And I'll say this again and again, that I prefer death metal kind of in that 88 to 91 range. Not that I dislike albums after that. It's just I really vibe with when the thrash and the death metal were coming together. And this also adds elements of progressive. Atheist would go on to be a lot more jazzy, I would say. I mean, there are parts of this that are super avant-garde, but their next couple albums would be way out there. This is still rooted in thrash metal, I would say. So Atheist, Piece of Time. And that'll wrap it up for part 1. And I'll see you in the next part.